There's a moment in every connection where silence starts speaking louder than words. You stop texting, you stop checking in, you pull your energy back, not as a game, but as a shift. And what happens next often reveals more than all the conversations you ever had. Because when someone is truly used to your presence, your attention, your consistency, your silence doesn't go unnoticed. It creates a gap. And that gap starts to show what your presence actually meant. If she misses you after you go silent, it's not about ego or control. It's about emotional imprint. People don't miss noise. They miss meaning. They miss the way you made them feel without trying too hard. They miss the consistency they didn't realize was stabilizing their emotions. At first, she might act like nothing has changed. She might continue her routine, post normally, reply differently, or even appear unaffected. But silence has a strange way of stretching time. And over time, emotional memory starts to surface. She starts noticing the absence in small moments, the message that didn't come in, the attention that used to be there but isn't anymore, the comfort she didn't have to ask for but always received. And that's when the mind begins to replay old interactions, not because she suddenly changed, but because absence forces reflection. When someone is always available, they become background noise in someone's life. But when they disappear, they become a question. And that question grows slowly. She might start checking her phone more often than usual, not because she expects something, but because her habits were built around your presence, even if she doesn't admit it. There's a subtle shift in her energy. Curiosity comes first, then comparison, then memory. She remembers how easily conversations flowed with you, how you used to show up without hesitation, how your attention felt different from others. But here's the truth most people miss. Missing someone is not always about love in the romantic sense. Sometimes it's about emotional regulation. You became part of her emotional rhythm. Your messages, your attention, your presence created a pattern in her mind. When that pattern breaks, the mind reacts. If she starts reaching out after you go silent, it's not random. It usually comes in stages. First, indirect signals. She might view your stories more often. She might like something small just to re-enter your awareness. She might send something casual, something that doesn't fully expose her intention. It's a test, a soft re-entry into your world without risking rejection. Then comes curiosity disguised as normal conversation. How are you? What's new? You've been quiet. These aren't just questions. They are openings. They are attempts to measure if the emotional door is still unlocked. Because silence changes perception. When you are always available, your value is assumed. When you become absent, your value is questioned. And if the silence was meaningful enough, she starts to feel it in unexpected moments. Not in dramatic emotional breakdowns, but in ordinary situations. A joke she would normally send you, a thought she used to share with you first, a moment of boredom where your presence would normally fill the gap. That's where missing someone becomes real. But there's another layer to this. Not every silence creates longing. Some silences create relief. And this is where emotional maturity matters. If the connection was draining, inconsistent, or one-sided, silence might not trigger missing at all. It might trigger peace. That's why silence is not a trick to use on someone. It is a mirror. It reflects the actual emotional weight you carried in their life. If she truly misses you, after you go silent, it usually means your presence had depth. Not just attention, but emotional presence. You weren't just someone she talked to. You were someone she felt. And feeling leaves a deeper imprint than interaction ever does. At some point, she may try to reconnect in a more direct way, not always with strong emotion, but with subtle vulnerability. A message that feels casual on the surface, but carries weight underneath. Something like checking in late at night or remembering a detail from the past. Because when someone misses you, they don't always know how to say it directly. They start with fragments. And how you respond to that moment matters because silence changes dynamics. It resets emotional positioning. When you were always available, your attention had low contrast. Now your attention has context. It is no longer automatic. It is selective. That changes how it is perceived. But here is something important to understand. Missing you does not always equal choosing you. Snorts. Someone can miss your presence and still not be ready, willing, or capable of building consistency with you. Emotion and action are not the same thing. Memory and decision are not the same thing. That's why silence reveals truth, but it does not guarantee outcome. It shows you where you stand in someone's emotional world, but it does not force them to act differently. It only removes noise so clarity can appear. If she comes back after your silence, what she brings with her matters more than the fact that she came back, because some people return out of emotion and some return out of habit. Some return because they genuinely felt your absence. Others return because they are reacting to temporary emptiness in their own life. And those two motivations are not the same. Real missing shows consistency in behavior. It shows effort. It shows a willingness to rebuild something with awareness of what was lost. Temporary missing shows inconsistency. It comes and goes like waves depending on mood and circumstance. There's also a silent truth here that many people ignore. When you step back, you also start to see yourself differently. Silence doesn't only affect the other person. It reveals how much of your identity was tied to being available. It forces you to observe your own emotional dependency, your own attachment patterns, your own expectations. Because sometimes what feels like she misses me is also I miss being needed. And that distinction matters more than people want to admit. Emotional clarity requires honesty with yourself first. If she truly misses you after silence, it will not feel chaotic. It will feel steady. Not overwhelming attention, not confusion, but a grounded return. She will not just appear when she is bored or uncertain. She will appear with intention. Even if it is small, it will feel different. But if the pattern is inconsistent, if she only reaches out when your absence benefits her emotionally, then what she misses is access, not connection. And access is not the same as value. Access is convenience. Value is choice. Silence exposes that difference very clearly. And in that exposure, you begin to understand something deeper about relationships in general. Real connection does not need disappearance to prove existence. It remains present even in distance. It does not rely on absence to create appreciation. It already carries appreciation within consistency. So when you go silent and she misses you, what you are really witnessing is not just her reaction. You are witnessing the space you occupied in her emotional world becoming empty enough to notice. And whether she fills that space with intention or leaves it as memory determines everything about what comes next. Because silence doesn't create feelings, it reveals them. And when that silence continues, something even deeper starts to unfold. The first reaction is always surface level adjustment. She tells herself she's fine. She tries to maintain normal routine. She acts like nothing has shifted. But human emotion doesn't stay quiet for long when something real is missing. It doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It just changes form. At first, she might fill the gap with distractions, friends, social media, small conversations, anything that keeps her mind from returning to the same thought. But distraction only works when the emotional weight is light. When someone has genuinely impacted your emotional rhythm, distraction only delays reflection. It doesn't replace it. And slowly, your absence becomes part of her awareness, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in subtle interruptions of thought. She'll be in the middle of something completely unrelated and suddenly remember a conversation, a moment, a feeling she didn't fully appreciate at the time. That's how missing someone grows. Not in constant pain, but in unexpected reminders. There is also something interesting that happens when a person realizes they can no longer access you easily. Your value in their mind begins to shift, not because you changed, but because availability changed. Human psychology often confuses availability with importance. When something is always present, it is mentally categorized as stable background. When it disappears, it becomes emotionally significant again. She might begin to reevaluate old conversations. Things she once overlooked suddenly feel different. A message you sent that she didn't respond to properly now feels heavier. A moment where you showed care now feels more meaningful in hindsight. This is emotional recalibration. The mind rewriting interpretation based on absence. And during this stage, curiosity becomes stronger than pride. Curiosity is what drives her to check your profile, your activity, your presence, not necessarily to act, but to observe. Observation is the safest form of emotional engagement. It allows her to stay connected without risking vulnerability. But here's the quiet truth behind this behavior. When someone is emotionally impacted by your silence, they don't just miss you, they start imagining you. The mind fills gaps with assumptions. What is he doing? Has he moved on? Is he talking to someone else? These thoughts are not facts. They are emotional projections created by uncertainty. Uncertainty is powerful. It forces the mind to search for answers, even when none are given. And in that search, your importance can grow not because of new actions, but because of unanswered space. However, this is also where things become complex because missing someone does not always lead to healthy reconnection. Sometimes it leads to emotional confusion. She may miss you, but also resist that feeling. She may feel your absence, but try to convince herself it doesn't matter. This internal conflict creates mixed behavior. One day, she might seem closer, the next day, distant again. One moment, she might engage indirectly. Another moment, she might withdraw completely. This push and pull is not manipulation. In most cases, it is emotional uncertainty trying to stabilize itself. And during all this, your silence continues doing its work, not as punishment, but as clarity, because silence does something words cannot do. It removes reassurance. And when reassurance is gone, reality becomes visible. If she truly misses you, she will eventually move past observation into action. Action doesn't always mean dramatic confession. Sometimes it is a simple message that carries emotional weight beneath its simplicity. Something like reconnecting without a strong reason. Something that doesn't need explanation because the reason is already emotional. But even then, timing matters because emotional readiness is not always aligned between two people. She might feel the absence deeply, but still not be ready to rebuild consistency. That is where most reconnections struggle. Feeling is not the same as commitment. And this is where your position changes as well. Silence does not just affect how she sees you, it also reshapes how you see her. When you are no longer constantly engaged, your perspective clears. You begin to notice patterns instead of moments. You see consistency instead of emotion spikes. You stop reacting and start observing. This is important because clarity often arrives in silence, not in communication. When you are constantly talking to someone, you are inside the emotion. When you step back, you can see it from outside. At this stage, you start to understand something very important. Not every connection that creates emotion is meant to continue in the same form. Some people feel deeply, but cannot maintain stability. Some people miss you, but only in absence, not in presence. And presence is what relationships actually require. So when she misses you after silence, the real question is not whether she feels something. The real question is what kind of feeling it is Is it attachment or appreciation? Is it habit or recognition? Is it loneliness or genuine value? Because loneliness can make anyone miss anyone, but value creates consistent effort. And over time, patterns reveal truth more than emotions do. If she reaches out only when she is emotionally low, that is not connection. That is emotional dependency on comfort. If she reaches out with consistency, awareness, and effort, that is something closer to genuine recognition of your place in her life. But even then, you must understand something deeper about silence itself. Silence is not just a strategy between two people. It is a reflection of self-control. It shows that you are no longer reacting to every emotional impulse. You are no longer chasing clarity through constant communication. You are allowing space to show you what is real. And in that space, something shifts internally. You begin to detach from outcome because whether she misses you or not stops being the only focus. You start focusing on what kind of connection deserves your attention in the first place. This is where emotional maturity develops. Not in trying to get someone to miss you, but in realizing that missing you is not enough if it does not lead to stability. There is also a silent emotional trap many people fall into. When someone returns after silence, it can feel like validation. It can feel like proof of importance. But validation is temporary if behavior does not change. Someone can return because they felt your absence, but still repeat the same patterns that created distance in the first place. That is why silence alone is not transformation. It is exposure. It shows what already exists. It does not create something new out of nothing. If she misses you in a meaningful way, it will eventually reflect in how she treats you when she has access to you again. Not just how she feels in your absence, but how she behaves in your presence. Because real emotional connection is not measured by longing alone. It is measured by consistency when longing is satisfied. And there is another layer to this that often goes unnoticed. While she is processing your absence, you are also changing. Silence does not only affect one side, it shifts both perspectives. You start realizing what you tolerated, what you ignored, what you gave without receiving, what you called connection, but might have been imbalance. This awareness is powerful because it removes illusion. And once illusion is gone, you can no longer be easily pulled back into something that does not align with your emotional clarity. So when she misses you after you go silent, it becomes a mirror for both sides. For her, it reveals emotional attachment and uncertainty. For you, it reveals awareness and value recalibration. And in that mirror, the truth becomes simple. Missing someone is not the final answer. It is only the beginning of understanding what that person meant in your emotional structure. Because what truly matters is not whether she misses you in silence, but whether your presence in her life and hers in yours can exist without confusion, inconsistency, or emotional imbalance. And when you go even deeper into this idea, you start realizing something most people never fully understand. Silence doesn't just test her emotions. It exposes the foundation of how she connects with people in general. Some people are conditioned to respond to consistency, while others only recognize value when it is removed. That difference changes everything about how missing someone actually plays out. If she is someone who is emotionally aware, your silence will not confuse her for long. It will quickly turn into reflection. She will start connecting dots between your behavior and her own responses. She will remember not just the good moments, but also the moments she didn't give enough attention, the times she assumed you would always be there, the situations where she delayed or minimized her effort. Silence has a way of bringing accountability into focus without confrontation. But if she is more emotionally reactive, your absence might first feel like irritation before it feels like loss. She might tell herself that you are simply being distant or dramatic. She might try to justify her own detachment by convincing herself that nothing meaningful is actually missing. This stage is important because denial often comes before realization. People don't immediately accept emotional gaps. They resist them first. During this resistance phase, she may behave in ways that seem contradictory. She might avoid reaching out yet still monitor your presence. She might convince herself she doesn't care, yet still feel a subtle discomfort when she realizes you are not reacting to her life anymore. This internal contradiction is where emotional truth starts to surface. Because indifference does not create tension, only suppressed emotion does. And while all of this is happening internally for her, your silence is doing something equally important externally. It is changing the emotional structure between you. When you were available, interaction was automatic. Now, interaction becomes intentional. That shift alone alters perception. People value what requires effort, even subconsciously. Not because effort equals worth, but because effort signals change and access. At some point, if she misses you deeply enough, she may start creating indirect pathways to reconnect. Not always direct messages. Sometimes it is through shared spaces, mutual connections, or subtle engagement that doesn't fully expose her intention. This is not always manipulation. Often it is hesitation because reaching out directly requires emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability feels risky when pride and uncertainty are involved. But even indirect contact carries meaning. It shows that your absence has crossed the threshold of awareness into emotional relevance. You are no longer just part of memory, you are part of present thought. And that is where silence becomes most powerful. It turns memory into active reflection. However, there is another truth that sits quietly underneath all of this. Missing someone is not always linear, it fluctuates. One day, she might feel the absence strongly. Another day, she might feel detached again. This fluctuation does not mean the feeling is fake. It means the mind is trying to stabilize emotional imbalance. Humans do not process loss in a straight line. They oscillate between acceptance and resistance. And during this oscillation, perception of you can also change. In moments of emotional intensity, she might idealize your presence, remembering only the comfort and emotional connection. In moments of emotional stability, she might downplay it, convincing herself that she is fine without it. This back and forth is part of emotional processing, not necessarily confusion. Meanwhile, your silence continues shaping the narrative without words, because silence removes influence. When you are actively communicating, you are shaping how you are perceived in real time. When you are absent, perception is built entirely on memory and emotion. And memory is never fully accurate. It is filtered through feeling. That is why absence often amplifies significance. Not because the connection has suddenly become stronger, but because the mind fills in gaps with emotional interpretation. The more unanswered space there is, the more imagination participates in defining your role in her mind. If she eventually reaches out in a more grounded way, the tone of that communication matters more than the fact of it happening. A grounded return feels calm, intentional, and aware. It does not rely on emotional spikes or confusion. It acknowledges distance without dramatizing it. That kind of return often indicates genuine emotional processing has taken place. But if the return is inconsistent, impulsive, or driven by temporary emotion, it often lacks stability. It might feel intense in the moment, but intensity alone cannot sustain connection. Without consistency, emotional cycles repeat, and silence becomes a repeated pattern rather than a turning point. This is where your awareness becomes critical, because silence can teach you not only about her feelings, but about your own emotional boundaries. You start recognizing whether you were overinvested, whether you were emotionally overextending, whether your presence was being valued or simply used as emotional convenience. And that realization changes how you respond. If she reappears, you are no longer responding from absence or longing. You are responding from clarity. And clarity shifts everything about interaction. It removes urgency. It replaces emotional dependency with observation. At this stage, the focus is no longer just, does she miss me, but what does her behavior actually represent in the bigger picture? Because missing someone is only meaningful if it leads to alignment. Otherwise, it remains a temporary emotional reaction that fades once circumstances change again. And there is a deeper layer still. When you step back long enough, you begin to see that silence doesn't just reveal her emotional state, it reveals your emotional patterns too. You notice how quickly you wanted reassurance, how easily you associated attention with value, how strongly you responded to small changes in communication. This awareness is uncomfortable at first, but it is necessary because emotional growth does not come from being chosen or missed. It comes from understanding what kind of connection you actually need to remain stable within yourself. So when she misses you after you go silent, it becomes part of a larger emotional equation, not the entire answer. It is one signal among many. It shows that you mattered in some capacity, but it does not automatically define the depth, quality, or future of that connection. And in that space of understanding, silence stops being about waiting for a reaction. It becomes about observing truth without distortion.